We're now going to start talking about thinking about interference in 2 dimensions. This is really also going to be the same as thinking about interference in 3 dimensions, since typically when we're thinking about 3 dimensions, we do 2-dimensional cross-sections. So everything we're going to talk about is going to look 3-dimensional, and we're going to talk about it as if it's it's going to look 2-dimensional. We're going to talk about it as if it's 2-dimensional, but really all of this applies to 3-dimensional as well. So the first thing to remember is that when we're trying to think about and visualize waves in 2 or 3 dimensions, we're going to use these wavefront diagrams. So typically we put our source in the center, and each circle here is going to represent the location of a crest. So notice in this point we see a sine wave that looks like it's getting smaller in amplitude, and in this case we would represent it that way to show that your amplitude is decreasing as you get further away, but if you integrate it, again your intensity, over the entire area, you would actually get the same amount of energy. Now one thing, if you look really carefully at this, you might say, hey, the circle here doesn't align with the crest. But it actually does. If you drop your crest down and think about that being a right angle, the circle shouldn't necessarily be going through the crest there, but where the crest goes on the line is where that circle is. So that's just kind of a detail. So remember, each circle represents a crest, the trough is halfway through, and so we have a wavelength spacing between the circles. And it's really important that you understand this, since when we go to do interference with these, it can be a little tricky to interpret if you're not comfortable with this. So now we want to talk about 2 sources, and the picture on the right here shows, for instance, the waves that would occur from just, for instance, drips in water. And so we can have 2 sources in the water. We see that we have these ripples, and you kind of notice that there are these almost lines going out, that something's happening here, and that is due to the interference. So these sorts of pictures can be a little hard to interpret what's going on, but recognize that this is something that you could visually see on the surface of water. So what we're going to be thinking about here are 2 of those wavefront diagrams. We're going to have the green one and the blue one. So we have 2 different sources, and notice that the circles then correspond in color to the source. So even though this blue circle passes through the green source, it is coming from the blue source. So far, hopefully that makes sense to you. Now what we're going to do is look at where those circles intersect. So this intersection point here lies on both a green circle and a blue circle. So that corresponds to a crest of the green source and a crest of the blue source. Therefore, this is a point where you expect to have constructive interference. You have a crest from each of them. When we look at this point, we again have the intersection of those 2 circles, so each one is a crest. What about this point here? This actually corresponds to the trough. Remember that the trough is in between. So you see this point is actually perfectly in between the 2 green circles, which means this is a green trough. But notice that it is also perfectly in between blue circles, which means it's a blue trough. So if we thought about this being a 1-dimensional wave, and we see something that looks like that, when the troughs align, this is still corresponding to constructive interference. So this point here is also constructive interference. Later we're going to talk about the fact that there are in fact lines here, that these points do always fall on a line. But the thing that I find most challenging here is to recognize that these points correspond to constructive interference because you are at 2 troughs. Let's now look at the black dots, which actually represent destructive interference. So, for instance, this first one here lies on a green circle, so that's going to be a green crest. But notice that it is in between the blue circles, which means it is a blue trough. So that point here corresponds to, for instance, something like this, but for the blue one, that was opposite. So obviously this is destructive interference, we know that, and that is basically what is happening there. We are on a green crest and a blue trough, so those waves cancel. Again, that next point is at a blue crest and a green trough, green crest, blue trough, and so on. So the thing to think about here is it's probably simplest to notice that the intersection of two circles is constructive interference, crest with crest. When you see one line and it's in the center of two circles, that's destructive interference because that's crest trough. The trickiest might be these dots that lie on neither circle, but are in between each of them, which is therefore trough-trough and also constructive. So again, think through what these wavefronts represent, and when you're actually trying to work on one of these problems, it's really helpful to really draw this out and think about what's going on. And remember that the circles only represent crests, so they should be equally spaced, and the spacing between them then should be one wavelength.